focusing on our situations and circumstances, what that does is that places a veil or a covering over our eyes. And once that covering is placed over our eyes, what it does is it distorts our perception so that we can't see clearly. We can't see clearly in spiritual terms. Because in order to see clearly, we have to see things the way that God sees things. But the only way that a natural being can see things that a supernatural being can see is if we're looking from a spiritual perspective. And so what we do is when we allow situations and circumstances to distort our view, when we focus our attention on life and its situations or different circumstances, what that does is it begins to then govern our emotions. And the downside to focusing on situations and or circumstances is that when it becomes, or when it gets to the point to where it starts to govern our emotions, what it does is it causes us to react or respond negatively and often irrationally. And so when we then begin to respond irrationally or in a negative like manner, we then can't see God's sovereign hand shifting and maneuvering things around in his sovereignty to make things work out. You remember Romans 8:28 says that all things work together for the good of them that love the Lord, called according to his purpose. Now it says all things. It doesn't say most things. It doesn't say some things. It doesn't say every other thing. It says all things. In other words, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So therefore, if God says that all things begin to work out for our good, that means that even in the bad things, as long as we don't focus our attention on just that bad thing, we can see things from a supernatural perspective, and we can relate back to Romans 8:28 to where it says that all things work together for our good. But the Apostle Paul, he actually said it best in Philippians 4. Verse 11. It starts in verse 11. He says, "Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am in. I know how to get along with by humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Now, verses 11 through 13, that was actually a mind-blowing, dynamic passage between those two verses, because what the Apostle Paul tells us in so many words is that it's a secret. But he actually reveals the secret. What he says is, I have been hungry. I've had plenty. I know what it's like to live by humble means, but I also know what it's like to live in prosperity. Now, regardless of the situation or circumstance that I'm in, I know how to be content. And the contentment that the Apostle Paul has isn't from focusing on the negative or the positive, the good or the bad, the situation or the circumstance. The contentment comes from reshifting his focus. Instead of focusing on the circumstance, what he says is, I fix my eyes on Jesus. Because he says in verse 13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. And in other words, the him that he's referring to is Jesus Christ. So in Jesus, I can do all things, and all things, well, the situations and circumstances fall in the category of all things, because all includes the whole capacity of the good things or the bad things, the being in poverty or having plenty of, or being hungry or being well fed. So what he says is, in order to be content, what you don't focus on is the situation or circumstance that you may be in. You don't focus on the good, the bad or the ugly. You focus on Jesus, because then as long as you're focusing on Jesus, you can see his sovereign hand moving in your life, regardless of if you're doing good or if you're doing bad. If everything seems to be falling in your favor or everything is falling out of your favor, regardless of the situation or circumstance, the secret of becoming content is reshifting your focus to focusing on Jesus. So basically, I just wanted to share that with you all today, because that was actually something that I needed to have ministered to myself, because a lot of times I'm guilty of allowing life to govern over or rule over or dictate my emotions. And when I allow life to dictate my emotions, what I do is I sometimes react negatively or irrationally. And when you react negatively, what you do is you charge your atmosphere with negativity. And the results, of course, of charging the atmosphere with negativity is, of course, yielding negative results. Because the more you respond in a negative manner, the less you'll be able to see God's sovereign hand at work, and the more circles you'll actually make around the same mountain. Just like the children of Israel, what could have taken them about 30 days in terms of a walking journey to get from Egypt to the promised land, their place of promise called Canaan, what would have taken them about 30 days just walking, if they had continued focusing on Jesus instead of focusing on situations and circumstance, wound up taking them 40 years. And so that's usually what happens when our focus goes from being focused on Jesus to being focused on life or whatever situations or circumstances that we may be going through. So I just want to encourage you guys and say, regardless of whatever it is that you may be going through, and I'm speaking to myself as well, regardless of whatever the situation that you may be going through in life, as long as you can remember to keep your eyes fixed on the author and finisher of our faith, then you know that Romans 8:28 is true, that all things work together for the good. So if you know that everything is going to work out in your favor for the good in the end, then why even worry about it in the middle? Because if everything is going to work out in the end and it's not working out now, then you know that it's not the end. So, hey, keep your head up. Y'all be cool.